We pledge every effort. You want me to bring it down? Should I bring it down?
Recording in
I
No song. consciousness of the need for accountable organizations in order to give a credible voice that is representative of the African community, both locally and internationally. It is a time of deceit at the highest levels. For example, when the highest office in the government allegedly facilitates the creation of fake African organizations to ostensibly represent the African community, but disregards standing legitimate ones. Folks, welcome to our times and to this activity, the 10th annual forum of the State of African Guyanese in a one-sided one Guyana. We're coming from Critchlow Labor College in Thomas Land's Georgetown, Guyana. We note that this year, 2023, is the 260th anniversary of the 1763 revolution and the 200th anniversary of the 1823 rebellion. And a luta continua. The struggle continues. We will have a libation from Mr. Royston Peters, and immediately after that, moderator Mr. David Hines will take us through the rest of today's session. Again, welcome and enjoy. Mr. Peters.
Good afternoon, colleagues. As was indicated, I will assist in performing the libation. It's going to be a simple process. I'm removing my footwear because I want to be able to touch firmly on the wooden surface of this floor to have the energies and vibrations moving through. And I have with me some cow's milk, which I'm going to use in the process today. Based on the theme of this symposium, I think it's essential for us to seek to revitalize ourselves and to have a recommittal to the process. And so I choose to use cow's milk to engage in that process. And so it will be. Let me just assure you that this libation is one of which our co-parents would have been part of when they would have been here in earlier times. So all I'm doing is just reigniting of theirs and taking it to the next level. Let me just comfort you that you will see nothing going up, no nothing coming down. It's a simple paying homage to our ancestors for what they have done, recommitting ourselves to the process and asking for forgiveness for the things that we should have done that we didn't do. What I'm going to do is to offer supplication, then I'll pour the libation. So it says, O cosmic birther of all radiation and vibrations, soften the ground of our bodies and carve out a space within us where your presence can abide. Fill us with your creativity so that we may be empowered to bear the fruits of thy mission. Let our actions bear fruit according to our desires. Endow us with your wisdom to produce and serve what each other being needs to flourish. Untie the tangled threads of destiny that binds us as we release others from their entanglement of past mistakes. Do not let us be seduced by that which would divert us from our true purpose that illuminates the opportunities of our present movement. For you are the ground of fruitfulness, the mission, the birth, the power, and the fulfillment of all that is gathered and made whole again. And so it is. That's a supplication I want to offer. And with that, I would want to ask you to join with me as we do a Ghanaian chant, one which I learned right here from one of our sisters, Queen Mother Elfrida, after her mission to Ghana and return. For those of us who know it, you can please join in. It says, Dana se, da una mina se. Dana se, da una mina se. If you say, oh yeah, Dana do so. Dana se, da una mina se. Dana se, da una mina se. If you say, oh yeah, Dana so, Dana se, da una mina se. Dana se, da una mina se. And so as I pour libation, I wish to recall the struggles of 1763, which involved our brother Kofi, who, as an enslaved person, wrestled against the oppressive state, overturned them, and who became governor of Guyana for at least 1 year. So the energies and dynamism of Kofi, we say, Ashe. And let me just again indicate that I'm pouring this libation onto a piece of earth that's in this bucket. I don't want to put on the granite, the tiles. So I'm putting on a piece of earth. And we ask that even as we call upon the efforts of Kofi, had his energies reinvigorate us here today so that we can take forward a similar charge and challenge to those oppressors of today who seek to want to impede our path. Ashe. We throw libation for the Demerara revolt of 1823, for which we resist, and for which we suffered. On that occasion, our ancestors, Kwamina, chose not to take out any of the oppressors, for which we lost several lives, and for which our grandparents were beheaded and their heads placed on stakes along the East Coast corridor and at what we now know as Parade Ground. So the struggles of Kwamina and our ancestors, we pour libation, we say, Ashe. And as we pour libation, again, we ask that those energies of our ancestors back then who waged struggles against the oppressors, that we be able to inherit from their energies, from their consciousness, so that we too can do likewise and not be passive and relax and not resist. Ashe. I wish to pour libation to another one of our great ancestors, perhaps sometimes being ignored, and I call upon our ancestor, Damon. Damon, when recognizing that we were granted freedom, liberation, he rose the flag of independence, for which he was charged summarily for some other thing and was able to, and lost his life for that. So Damon, before libation, we say Ache. Before libation to the other members of the African community who served with Damon, with Kwamina, with Kofi, we call upon Akara and ask that the powers of Akara, the energies that Akara possess, find itself in our bodies, in our soul, in our spirits, so that we can be energized to wage struggle for our own independence and the survival of those, our young ones to come. I want to pay particular homage to our women who were always involved in the battles with our men, but who for some reason have not been made mention of. I want to pour libation for all the women, whether it's Janet or whoever else. I'm not talking about this white Janet, I'm talking about the Janet that we know, or all others who waged the battle against the oppressors for the liberation from the struggles that we once faced or were faced with. We pour libation to them. Ashe, Ashe. And so to commit to the process, I offer on my behalf, and with your permission, if you so desire, to offer our apologies to our ancestors for ignoring them for too long. They have always been here among us. We choose to ignore them. In this process, it's a recommittal to re-engaging with them, to seeking their guidance, their advice, because they once went through this path before. They understand the struggle. They can inspire us to do things only if we so desire. So I'm seeking your permission to clear the pathway, to invite them to join with us as we seek to invite them to assist us in the struggles we want to pursue. Ashe. And so to commit our requests and our apologies to ancestors and to ourselves, I will also share in a sip of this libation to solidify the promise and the pledge so committed. Ashe. Thank you. Done.
Jambo, welcome again to the Coffee 250 State of the African Guyanese. We come to make another stop in our continued journey to real emancipation. Not that we ever had any doubt that we were an emancipated people. We were always emancipated because we're human beings with souls, and even the heinous moment of enslavement did not extinguish the light that has always shone so brightly among us as African people, as Black people. Our program today, therefore, speaks to the present moment of that process of emancipation. And this moment is especially important because it brings into question something that is fundamental to the African in Guyana and the rest of the African diaspora. And that is the question of our unpaid labor for over 2 centuries, and in some respects, 4 centuries. In our Guyana, that is important because we have been blessed with a commodity that could bring some material wealth to our country. And the coming of that wealth then raises the question of distribution, equal and equitable distribution of the wealth. And in any society in which the vexed question of compensation is central, when you don't have resources, it becomes even more important when you have resources. We've been grappling with the question of reparations forever. It gained steam in the last 2 or 3 decades. And our reparations demands have been targeted to our colonial masters, our former colonial masters, our former enslavers, and some may say present enslavers. But with the coming of wealth to Guyana, as part of the patrimony of our country and our state, we are making bold to extend reparations to include the state of Guyana, because the state of Guyana could now afford reparations. And so part of what we come today to talk about is exactly that. There is the slogan of One Guyana. It is not a new slogan. We have played around with slogans since independence. Some of them have been more than slogans. Some of them have been aspirations. And so we want to make a distinction between the aspiration of one people, one nation, one destiny, and the slogan of One Guyana. And in any case, we have made a judgment of One Guyana. And that judgment is that it's a one-sided One Guyana. Last year, we made bold to declare that we saw signs of apartheid. And it became controversial, as if some or the other, apartheid is confined to a place called South Africa. Apartheid simply means segregation, apartness. It's the Afrikaans word for segregation and apartness. In the United States, they call it segregation. In our Caribbean and Guyana, we called it colonialism. And so therefore, it's not new. We live apart in Guyana in many respects, physically apart in our own communities. We did not fix that. We did not do it that way. That is part of the legacy of our history. And so when we talked about apartheid last year, we were talking about the way in which the state, in the era of more resources, was beginning to act. We weren't talking about laws, because as the United Nations has declared, and in the decade for the people of African descent, is that lots of countries around the world in the diaspora have made significant strides in terms of laws that protect citizens against inequality. But they said that those laws have not resulted in the end of discrimination against peoples of African descent. That's what the United Nations said. And so therefore, when we declared that we saw an emerging apartheid state, we were talking about the practice of the state. The practice of the state. There is de jure apartheid, that's apartheid by law, and de facto apartheid, apartheid by practice. And over time, practice can lead to law. Slavery started as an economic institution, and then it moved to include the law, include politics, include everything that had to do with human and social relations. So even though laws may not now be apartheid laws, when you start with the practice of apartheid, it can and it will eventually lead to laws, because laws are made to justify practices. Just as the issue of race, the phenomenon of race was created to justify slavery, and then the laws follow. So we come again today to extend that discussion, because we feel it's a discussion that is particular to African Guyanese, but it is general to our country. The African Guyanese experience is not an experience of superiority, but it's an experience that is central to an understanding of our society. You take away the experience of enslavement from Guyana and the rest of the diaspora, and the face of our society changes drastically. And so, like Black Stalin said, we come on the same ship from the same place. And he wasn't speaking just about the African ship or the ships that brought Africans across the Middle Passage. Is that all ethnic groups came here from someplace else. And he was making that fundamental point, and he had to lecture Dr. Eric Williams, who was seeing the ship coming from the same place as simply Africa. And he was asking Stalin, what about India? And what about China? And so on and so on. Stalin said, there would be no Caribbean, no understanding of the Caribbean motion without an examination of the African experience. And so we come here again today to extend that conversation. And as usual, we bring together our minds, because so far we, to quote Rex Netterford, we have not given the world skyscrapers and all of those things, although we have contributed to the technology that give rise. But what we have given the world is our minds, our creative intellect and creative imagination. And so we come again to put our minds together, so that out of that coming together of the mind will come forth plans as to how we seek to speak to Guyana and speak with Guyana, and to renew our covenant always with Guyana and with the rest of the African diaspora. We live in a time when people are telling us we should choose who should lead us, who should speak for us, and who should speak with us. And in the spirit of recognition, in the spirit of self-determination, we have always demanded that we decide who speak for us and who speak to us. And we exercise that right today by inviting the top elected leader from the African Guyanese community. He's not the only leader. We have leaders of all stripes, elected and non-elected. But we choose today to invite the top elected leader to come to share with us and to bring his mind to bear on our conversation. We do not seek to entrap him. We do not seek to imprison him. What we seek is a conversation between the different strands of opinion, the different tendencies in our community. And it is against that background that we invite Mr. Aubrey Norton, the leader of the PNC and the leader of the opposition, to come today and to give opening remarks. Please welcome him.
Good afternoon. Let me first of all say thanks for the opportunity to discuss with you. We are sometimes caught up by events without recognizing the process. I believe that in a very consistent way, pre-1992, but more pronounced since 1992, there has been an orchestrated effort to either marginalize or destroy the African Guyanese community. I recall I was not back yet at home when the PPP came to power in 1992, and Dr. Jagan made the comment, I think, early 1993, that Africans were at the bottom of the ladder. While there was some resentment of it, we are still to address the reality. Now, one has to understand that in 1992, when the People's Progressive Party came to power, we had black rice millers, Ivor Allens of this world. I am now putting together a list of all of them. I think Derek Cummins, who is now a permanent secretary. And what we have seen is the constant destruction. And ultimately, we find ourselves in a position where we are no longer active in the rice industry. And it didn't happen by accident. It happened based on an orchestrated plan of the People's Progressive Party. And so today, we seem to have no place in the rice industry. The People's Progressive Party, as a political entity, continues to argue and do everything to ensure that sugar continues, even if it is uneconomical, while it refuses to put similar energy and investment in bauxite. And again, it speaks to the African Guyanese community being involved in bauxite. When they came to power in 1992, we had experienced a movement in the African Guyanese community. This movement occurred in large measure because of free education. Many people who were poor, didn't have the resources, ended up attending the University of Guyana, becoming educated, and using education as a tool for emancipation. By 1994, the government made a move that some people will consider innocuous unless you investigate it. They removed free education. And with the removal of free education, they instituted loans. What it meant is that many couldn't attend the university, and those African Guyanese in the majority who attended ended up until now in debt. So you remove an opportunity and Africans incur debt. to attend university. And that is why I told an audience, I believe one of the first tasks of an AP and UAFC government must be to forgive that debt, because it was clearly part of an orchestrated plan. And then while that was happening, you begin to shrink the scholarship offers to the point where you are no longer issuing scholarships in law. And you only have to look around to see that there's a dearth of African lawyers, and that you end up being reliant on very few, because they have removed or restricted the capacity of African Guyanese to become lawyers. And if you believe it was accident, when the APNU AFC came to power in 2015, they reintroduced it. And we started to train lawyers again. And then the PPP comes to power and they end it. So we must not believe that these are acts without a plan. They're clearly part of a plan. And what is the plan? The plan is to create a marginalized, dependent, uneconomically viable African community. And when one combines these, what one sees is the emergence of a dependent African community, an African community that is emerging in debt and is dependent. While doing that, they continue to instill fear. And it is critical to understand the importance of instilling fear, because as they take their measures, if they instill fear, they remove the activism from the African Guyanese community, and therefore give themselves the scope to dominate and control with a low probability of challenge. And so, in the process of instilling fear and the economic marginalization, they are also creating conditions for hopelessness. And this is one of the things we have to tangle with. We have got to find ways and means in the extant situation to induce hope. I told the emancipation activity at Dartmouth last night that we are much better off than our foreparents who were slaves. And if they, in such adverse conditions, could have challenged slavery and destroy it, we must be hopeful that we could destroy this form of racism that exists. And as they bring this hopelessness on, they create a relief valve. You must release some energy. And they produce a set of promoters who invite certain kinds of entertainment into the African Guyanese community so that they exhale at well-organized shows. And it is very important for us to understand the politics of entertainment in this country. Entertainment is no longer just entertainment. There is a politics of entertainment. Entertainment is being used to buttress the domination and control. And therefore, we have to see entertainment in a new light and actually guide our young people on understanding that there is need for entertainment, but entertainment that will re-enslave you cannot be the entertainment we are looking for. Simultaneously, there are two critical organizations that are predominantly African Guyanese that they have politicized, destroyed, and continue to use: the Ghana Police Force and the Ghana Defense Force. For them, domination and control of these two institutions are critical to them maintaining control of first the African Guyanese community, but the entire society. And so we need to pay careful attention to this whole process of politicizing the Ghana Police Force. The hope of emancipation is not just political, it is not just social, it is also economical. And when you see what is happening in the economic realm, you see no attempt to provide funding and resources to put African Guyanese into micro and small businesses. You see a handpicking of African Guyanese who give loyalty to the PPP as the people they promote as the symbol of the African Guyanese community. So in large measure, they are promoting people who they control and will not be involved in the genuine emancipation movement. And we need to know that, because economic emancipation is very, very critical as they politicize many elements of the society. Something as simple as the community development committees. If you follow the pattern in the country, the CDCs, there were elected CDCs when the People's Progressive Party came to power in 2020. They have changed virtually all in an undemocratic fashion. And anybody who isn't perceived to be People's Progressive Party or leaning in that direction are no longer functioning in CDCs. And so they are gradually taking these communities, and through the use of the CDC, if there's a word like PPPizing them, making them either PPP or appear to be in the control. And in the process, they play what I call optic politics. And probably the most extravagant of the optic politics is the use of state resources to put people in red t-shirts in the last local government election. They were creating an optical view in which African Guyanese were made to feel that, oh, a large section of our people are heading towards the People's Progressive Party. And you had to counter that to succeed. And we must not miss the PPP's historical attempt to play optical politics, create optics that result in hopelessness in you while promoting them as a multi-ethnic party, while the reality is different. And then we spoke about the economic marginalization, but they're not only economically marginalizing the African Guyanese community, they are destroying existing African organizations and creating parallel ones. And the process they become involved in, leading to that, is an interesting process. They demonize any organization they perceive to be close to the PNC or to the coalition. Ipadaji, just face it. Vincent Alexander had to, I think, file a lawsuit against Barry Jack Dew. So they're not only marginalizing, they are not only setting up parallel organization, but they are demonizing leaders. I mean, if you go on Facebook, you can find from the PPP outfits caricatures of Alexander, myself, you name the people. And this is not new. Historically, they have demonized African leaders. I told one PPP member of parliament, you must not forget that you actually peddled that Burnham was the 5th richest black man in the world. And until day like today, you cannot produce any evidence to that effect. But the job was done. And we have to pay careful attention to the demonization of political leaders, of activists. You saw what happened to Tacoma Gunse. It was a clear attempt to signal that we can put you in chains. And so one has to pay careful attention to that. And even as they destroy African organization, African leaders, they have already marginalized and destroyed the trade union movement. A large part of it is African Guyanese. And so they are cutting that element of representation from the wider trade union movement, but specifically from the African Guyanese trade union movement. And that is critical. But not only that, they increase the dependence by ensuring that they control the resources allocated as wages and salaries to the African Guyanese community. From 1992 until now, the People's Progressive Party has never given more than 8% wage increase. And the highest one came as a result of an arbitration award. It cannot be by accident that they argue on the one hand that we cannot increase wages, etc., because it will fuel inflation. But on the other hand, they allocate billions to contractors that is going into the system. Apart from the fact that the inflation argument is hollow, one has to recognize what is being done in terms of how they create the dependence and how they treat particularly the public service, the Guyana Police Force, the Guyana Defense Force. You see an orchestrated approach to ensure, one, they do not get a livable wage, and two, there is a dependence, a virtual living from day to day, paycheck to paycheck, while creating other avenues for their support base to move forward. And as they do that, they then come with pittance offering to the African Guyanese community. And they put a narrative out there that a lot of young African Guyanese follow, money circulating. You talk with some of them, we making money. It doesn't matter to them, or they don't stop to recognize they're not really making money. They're getting a pittance, and the people who are making money are using this pittance against them. And so all of these things go hand in hand. And then they refuse to change laws. Any law that is likely to bring change, they oppose it. You only have to look at how they latch on to the Chief Justice ruling about the voters list, which can be changed in Parliament by them alone if they want. But it fits in to their scheme of domination, and so they latch on to it. But one that probably passes quietly that the African Guyanese community doesn't pay attention to, and I want to urge you to pay attention to. They have endeared themselves to the diplomatic community. So that if you go to a diplomatic reception, you will find that it is predominantly PPP people carrying one narrative, and there is a clear underrepresentation of the African Guyanese community. And you all are aware that the diplomatic community plays an important role in our societies. And when they carry these narratives, those are the narratives they tend to hear. And so they're in the process of marginalizing and destroying the African Guyanese community, while at the same time strengthening their elite, so that the wealth of the society continues to be in their control. What I've attempted to do is identify some of the strands in what I call the PPP's attempt to dominate and control the African Guyanese society. And sometimes it is done in a hegemonistic way. And I'm using hegemony here in the Gramscian sense, meaning it is done in a way that the actual victims sometimes carry the message of their oppressors. Now, that is very critical, because when you are made to carry a message against your own interests, then you make the oppressors feel more powerful. So that I believe that we are at a point where actions are taken to ensure the marginalization or the destruction of the African Guyanese community. I do not believe that they can succeed in destroying the African Guyanese community. But I do believe they have done a good job of creating dependence, of marginalizing, and creating a sense of hopelessness, which we need to rectify. It is in this context I would like to make my contribution to these discussions. I have, with groups, work out solutions, but I thought the best thing to do here is to attempt to bring elements of the political economy of domination and control into the debate so that we can address it and hopefully come up with solutions. In closing, I want to wish you the best for today and going forward. I did ask to leave. I did indicate that I was going to be coming from Dartmouth to here and then on to Linden. But I wanted to honor the invitation. And so with those words, I think I want to wish you all the best and to say to you, I am disposed to being involved in discussions on the African Guyanese community. And I want to say to the entire world, which I said in Buxton, representation of the African community doesn't make you a racist. Every community has the right to analyze its own situation and to come up with its own proposals. And I urge you not to worry when you are described as racist. You are not here to dominate any other ethnic group. We are here to discuss, analyze, and understand our domination and to expose it to the world and take actions to deal with it. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Brother Aubrey. Thank you very much. The evolution of our community has meant that we've had to always throw up representatives with broad praxis. My students always ask me, why an African chemistry teacher will talk about John Coltrane in his chemistry class, or the historian talking about dance and cinema. And I often have to tell them that it is the nature of this society itself, that if you're coming up against a totalitarian system as enslavement and colonialism and domination, that you yourself in meeting the demands of pushing back against that system, you have to develop your own broad praxis. And so it is in that context that we invite our keynote speaker today, who is a lawyer by profession, but a warrior for social justice. One who brings together the law and economics and politics and popular music all together in the practice of his representation of our community. And representation is the key here. I remember a few weeks ago, some women went in front of his office to voice some concerns. And he came out from his office and engaged in a discussion with them. And I remember Sister Simona Broom said, "You be liar. We ain't care with nobody." He said, "You be liar." But I want to invite to the podium now to give our keynote address to the real liar, Mr. Nigel Hughes. Thank you, thank you.
Brothers and sisters, good afternoon. I want to take the opportunity to, as always, pay tribute and sacrifice to those that have suffered before us, those that have given their lives, and those that gave more than they had to allow us to be where we are today. Our ancestors deserve the highest possible accolades that we could possibly pay to them. I want also to salute today the efforts of those who are with us that continue the struggle in the most difficult of circumstances to ensure that never again do we return to that era where we were exploited. And I think it is important that we say thank you to them in their presence. I want to salute Dr. David Hines for his consistent struggle and battles on behalf of not only the African people, but on behalf of Guyanese for creating a better Guyana. I want particularly to recognize and celebrate Vincent Alexander, leader, intellectual, consistent, for what he continues to do for our community and for continuing to keep the message, whatever your views are on Mr. Burnham, for continuing to keep the message about independent thought, the future, and to plan always for the next day through the Burnham Foundation. Vincent. It is important that when we have the warriors from the past who are still with us, who can share their experiences of what it is that they went through in the past, but not so much what they went through in the past, but the circumstances that led them to do the things that they had to do in the past to ensure that we today can enjoy the benefits we have. Hamilton Green, former Prime Minister, I respect you. I think, and I say this in my personal experience, and I share it whenever I get the opportunity. I went to one of those, what you would probably call capitalist secondary schools, where the more privileged went to St. Stanislaus College. And it was amazing the impact, the propaganda that was not only hostile to Burnham, but that was personal to people like Mr. Green. It created an impact and an image and demonized these people. And it was only until several of us who went to that institution were afforded the opportunity not only of tertiary education, but of a different experience in Ghana, did we come to appreciate what was actually being done for our benefit that we did not see at the time. So I salute Vincent, Mr. Green, David, and I also want to salute those that didn't make it, those that were in the forefront, particularly the women of change in education. And I only mentioned this briefly before I come to what I really want to say today. Because education, and the leader of the opposition, Mr. Norton, mentioned it. But he mentioned it tangentially in terms of the consequence in 1992 of the reintroduction of fees for education. One of the greatest, for me, in my assessment, positive developments that impacted the African community and all communities in Guyana and reversed the vilest form of prejudice that existed was the introduction of free education in 1974. Every time I speak to a young lawyer and they don't understand that the privilege they have of being where they are started as a result of what happened in 74, because otherwise, had they been born into those circumstances now, they would not see the doors of a university. And so I want us to remember, particularly those of us who are of advanced age, that the young people haven't lost history. They are unaware of their own history and the sacrifices that have been done to allow them to reach their position where they take it for granted that education is a right, which it should be, but the sacrifices that went there that were made by our predecessors to allow them to get there. That's enough for my rant this afternoon. Forgive my poor manners. I want also to thank Coffee 250. Because last year when they were vilified for talking about an emerging, they never said we had reached the stage of apartheid, because there are too many warriors in our history to ever allow an apartheid state to come into existence in Guyana without a war. But they sounded the warning, and it's the statistics that I will come to will support it, about what was emerging. And therefore, it was a cry for us all to open our eyes to what is happening. We have been asleep for a long time. I come now to Article 15 of the Constitution of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, our Constitution. It says this: the goal of economic development includes the objective of laying the material basis for the greatest possible satisfaction of the people's growing material, cultural, and intellectual requirements, as well as the dynamically stable development of their personality, creativity, thank you so much, entrepreneurial skills, and cooperative relations in a plural society. And it ends with what I want to make as part of the theme of my suggestion today. It says, the state shall intervene to mitigate any deleterious effects of competition on individuals or groups of individuals. And I emphasize that because there's a view that in a free market, open society, if it is that you're exploited and that you are marginalized and that you are made irrelevant, the state has no role. Our Constitution says not that the state may, the state shall intervene to mitigate any deleterious effects of competition on individuals and groups of individuals. A year ago, when Coffee 250 hosted the conference under the theme, Resisting the Emerging Apartheid State, there were vociferous noises emanating from pretty prominent government and government-aligned quarters asking for the evidence and why haven't reports been made to international bodies in support of this proposition. Remember, that was the cry a year ago. Research was conducted and many instances continued on the issues of the biased allocation and distribution of resources. About a year ago, a presentation entitled Economy and Justice presented evidence that disclosed the allocation of some of the major economic resources of the Republic, including the following. Give me. 1 of every 6 gold export licenses that was allocated by the state was allocated to a person of African descent. 1 of 6. That means 5 of the 6 went elsewhere, and we know where elsewhere is. It disclosed that 100% of the contracts for the procurement of drugs was allocated to persons who were not of African descent. 100%. It also disclosed that not one single offshore block was allocated to any person of African descent. Just think about it. The future of this country for the next 25 years will depend on the production of oil. And not a single offshore block went to a person of African descent or an entity that could be described as controlled by persons of African descent. Only 9% of the stone quarry licenses were issued to persons of African descent. None of the shore bases or prospective shore bases was owned or was intended to be owned and operated by persons of African descent. In excess of 90% of the contracts for water treatment plants and supplies were issued to persons of a single ethnic group which were not African, and only 17% of the Ministry of Housing's contracts for road construction were awarded to persons of African descent. And that came out in that publication. The response of the government did not challenge the accuracy of the data, but they said that they were historic explanations for the disparity, and the vice president even said that there were categories in which African Guyanese did not even bid. That was the official response from the government. The evidence disclosed by this data would have signaled that there was a complete imbalance in the distribution of the state's resources in the award of contracts, which was not only not defensible, but that the collection of data on the distribution of resources was vital and necessary. And you would have expected that policies would have been put in place to rebalance what was obviously a great imbalance in the distribution of the country's resources. Because that's what you expect. If you say this is an accident of history, but it does disclose an imbalance, you have to start putting in place policies that would redress that imbalance so that you begin to rebalance what is clearly an injustice. 1 year later, excuse me, and there has been no announcement which acknowledges that the distribution of the state resources was lopsided, and certainly no announcements of the implementation of any policy which would bring and address the imbalances of the distribution of the state's resources. Perhaps of even greater importance is that after the publication of the data, which demonstrated the importance of the collection of disaggregated data, and it's important to understand the difference between disaggregated data and aggregated data. I can come to you and say, 10 people died of prostate cancer last year, and there are 5 ethnic groups. And the average is 2 persons per ethnic group would have died from prostate cancer. Disaggregated data may show that 8 of the 10 persons who died from prostate cancer came from the African community. And therefore, 8 out of 10, which is 80%, when the aggregated average is only 1/5, 20%, in the absence of knowing that 80% of the people in the African community died from prostate cancer, you may run around thinking that prostate cancer is an equal opportunity disease. And that is precisely why disaggregated data in a multi-ethnic community is crucial. As a matter of fact, as I go on, my proposition is we must elevate it to inclusion in the Constitution. Because you cannot, in a multi-ethnic society, discuss the impact of policy, health, or any aspect of your life if it is not disaggregated. Because otherwise, you will get a completely false picture. Perhaps it is a long and well-established scientific fact that disaggregated data can reveal deprivations and inequalities that may not be fully reflected in aggregated data. We must recognize that meaningful disaggregation of data by race and ethnicity is a crucial aspect of equity goals which require government commitment. We must allocate sustained spending to historically excluded populations and groups so that they're included in that disaggregated data. We must engage all communities, particularly the African communities, as partners in defining data questions, collection, and utilization. This would particularly help the indigenous community because then the disparity between the spending on one community as compared to theirs would become particularly evident. We must undertake to educate community members about the importance of data and fostering trust in the collection of data and the research community. We must collect, analyze, and report data from smaller and marginalized communities in ways that protect confidentiality, minimize risk, and avoid perpetuating stereotypes. Excuse me. Perhaps most importantly, we must advocate and demand policy changes as a result of the data disclosed by the research. So, in the example I gave before, if 8 out of 10 persons that die from prostate cancer come from the African community, then there needs to be more resources allocated to the African community to deal with prostate cancer. So it's not only the collection of the data, is that you must then, at the level of the state, adopt policies to address the inequities that have been disclosed as a result of the data. We must promote accountability mechanisms for entities that fail to adhere to existing minimum standards for disaggregated data collection. There is a lot of aggregated data being published recently. The most recent publication was on Friday, where the local content secretariat said that $333 million had been spent on local companies as a result of local content policies under the Act. Thank you so much, sir. You may think that's fantastic. $333 million have come into the Guyanese economy as a result of local content policies. But unless you disaggregate that 333 million, you will never find out how much of that money came into the African community. Because it may well be that only $300 million, that only $30 million came into the African community, while the 300 went elsewhere. Because you can't look at the numbers of companies that have been granted local content certificates. Because the certificate doesn't give you the contract, it just makes you eligible. And quite often, they give you certificates in areas that will never be relevant to oil and gas. But they will tell you, we have issued 400 certificates. If 300 of those certificates are for people selling soft drinks at the side of the road, it's not relevant to oil and gas. So we need the disaggregated data to understand the full effect and impact of where that $333 million was spent. Permit me to quote from our own Professor Terence Blackman, who is a proponent of this disaggregated data. He said, and I quote, "Disaggregating data is not a mere technical endeavor, but a critical step in dismantling systemic racism. By committing to data equity and ensuring that all communities are represented and visible in data, we can shift research, policies, narratives, and impact towards equity." So we begin to do the heavy lifting in equity, in equality. In a modern, multi-ethnic, multi-race society, disaggregated data should be elevated to a constitutional right. Article 15 of the Constitution, which I referred to earlier, said that the state must intervene to mitigate the deleterious effects of competition in groups. The data disclosed in the publication of Economy and Justice, which was not challenged, mandates the state to intervene immediately to address the deleterious effect of competition in the African Guyanese community. So an example would be, if only 19% of the quarry licenses are given to the African community, the state must immediately intervene, not wait for the next election or wait for the next sitting of the National Assembly. It must immediately intervene to ensure that more quarry licenses are issued to the African Guyanese community. Similarly, with gold export licenses, we're only 1 out of 6. And I know of at least 3 African Guyanese who have been applying for these licenses. But where only 1 out of 6 has been issued to the African Guyanese community, the state must intervene immediately to ensure that there's equity in the granting of those licenses by expanding the number of persons who are granted licenses to include persons from the African community who clearly have the capacity. This must be a demand, and it must require immediate action. There are 3 other areas of equal importance that I seek your indulgence to address briefly. They are the economics of our community, the constitutional architecture of this republic, excuse me, in an era of oil and gas, and our educational crisis. I think one can safely say that the current constitutional architecture in this country has either outlived its usefulness or is incapable of delivering any benefit to the citizens of this country in an equitable manner. The National Assembly has confirmed that it serves little purpose other than to rubber stamp the directives of the executive in the most toxic of circumstances. It rarely meets, and its subcommittees are of equal value. In an electorally divided society, which is reflective of our ethnic fault lines, the leadership of respective communities never meet, while the toxicity which exists between the communities increases daily. And you don't have to look very far into history where rival communities don't meet to find out what the consequences are. The transfer of all the executive power under the Constitution to the winner in a hopelessly divided society has been and continues to be most counterproductive. We should perhaps look at the historic data. There has never, ever been an era of unity in Guyana since independence, probably even before. And that's a fact. It's not a criticism of any previous leader. It is a fact of life. Our previous leaders have always been committed to the idea of unity. But the fact is, we have never had unity. We don't need to lament it, and I'm not asking anyone to explain it. What I'm asking is that we take it as a fact, just as how the sun will rise tomorrow in the east. We take it as a fact that we are not united, and we have never been united. And I want to proffer that the prospect of unity in the near future and in the medium future is a very, very dim prospect. So we're not waiting for Moses. We're in 2023. Let's accept there has been no unity and the prospect of unity does not exist. It's not the end of the world. What do you do with that information? We should accept this fact as the foundation to create what might be reasonably possible. So let's accept the fact that we don't see things the same way. We are not unified. If we start from the premise that trust has never been present, and the Vice President loves to say that all the time, trust must exist. It doesn't have to exist. In many places in the world, when often you go into business contracts, you don't go into business contracts based on trust. You're going into it with your eyes open. And it's because you expect mistrust that you seek to protect yourselves in the provisions in the contract. So if we start from the premise that trust has never been present and is unlikely to be present in the short and medium term, then let's start to begin to construct a constitution which is not premised on trust. It should perhaps start with the principles of the rule of law, equality, equity, and justice as the systems which underpin the Constitution. Where trust is not a prerequisite, then constitutional arrangements should not be premised on the assumption that the government of the day will be capable of governing for all without having to satisfy some inbuilt connotation arrangements that it must secure in the majority of the views of the majority of the stakeholders. The concept of simple majority must be replaced by the requirements of supermajorities, so at least we ensure that most voices are heard before major decisions are undertaken and executed. The incentive under these new arrangements would be to achieve consensus and not what currently operates under the guise of democracy. If we have learned anything about our constitutional democracy, is you can be elected to discriminate as a legitimate consequence of an election every 5 years. So if I elect you, you somehow become empowered to discriminate against me merely because you have got elected once every 5 years. The term of office in a multi-ethnic society like ours, where distrust or mistrust is abundant, should not have a term of 5 years. It should be 4 years. 5 years is too long a time for seething injustices, real or perceived, to be allowed to fester. National Assembly subcommittees should operate on the principle of supermajorities. Local government systems, which require an entirely separate consideration and discussion, and we don't have the time for it today. But if I were to recommend, I would certainly say Mr. Alexander has done work that is unparalleled in this relation. I come now to the African economic existence. On the anniversary of the 1823 uprising, it is perhaps appropriate to reflect upon the lessons of the post-emancipation economic systems imposed and the parallels with that system and the systems that are deployed today in Guyana. In the post-emancipation British Guyana, the colonial government determined that licenses should be issued only to Portuguese people. That is how the Portuguese people became the merchants. It wasn't by virtue of any greater skill. It was by virtue of the system that controlled the licensing and the permits. And after the Portuguese had been brought here as indentured, and that experiment failed, the British government issued licenses only to them, and they created the basis for the Portuguese wealth and the fact that the African people would always be the buyers. Because in the African communities, the only persons who were allowed to sell to them were the Portuguese under permits and licenses. If we fast forward to contemporary Guyana, we just have to ask ourselves, who issues the gold export licenses? Who issues the quarry licenses? Who issues the contracts? Who issues the contracts for pharmaceutical and drug procurement contracts? Who issues the contracts for offshore blocks and shore bases? It comes back to the use of state power and permitting to allow the development of only those persons that the state determines should progress. Is there any African business entity which is in the top 50 enterprises in Guyana? It's a question. I don't have the answer. And if they are, how many? Pick your area of economic activity: banking, insurance, oil and gas, construction, forestry resources, health procurement, rice. The leader of the opposition just told you what happened in rice, and the list goes on. None of these has any significant African presence. The young entrepreneurs who are struggling to get their oil and gas businesses off the ground have to contend with high interest rates, financial institutions which require land as collateral, and if and when they get past these hurdles, they're defeated on the basis that they lack experience. Whether this is by historic accident or not, it cannot persist. The policies to redress this imbalance must be implemented without delay. The redress that has to accompany this effort must provide financing, training, technical support, and amendments to the Financial Institutions Act to provide unsecured or creatively collateralized securities to the appropriate qualified African entrepreneurs. The current system by which contracts and opportunities which are made available to the African business community come with the requirement that either you must support the PPP or at a minimum, you must be completely silent against the PPP. This will have to go. History has always judged silence and complicity harshly in these times of moral consequence. Finally, education in an oil and gas society. And this perhaps is the most frightening insofar as what the statistics show. Modern oil and gas economy will require skilled labor force, of which the minimum level of qualification will be secondary education. Permit me to quote from an article by my brother Terence Campbell, and he was referring to published statistics. He says, of the 14 territories surveyed by CARICOM, the regional integration movement, Guyana has the lowest secondary survival rate with a score of 41%. That is the aggravated data on Guyana. 40%, 41% of our students across the board complete secondary education. The quote continues. The Ministry of Education, in its Education Sector Plan 2021 to 2025, which were based on 2017 statistics, highlighted a secondary school dropout rate of 50%. 50% of our students were dropping out of secondary school, and we were already in an oil economy. The ministry pointed out, and this is quote from the ministry, this is the Ministry of Education, more than 50% of Guyanese working age population has primary school education or less. I would be very interested if we disaggregate that data to find out in the African community what percentage of us actually have primary school education or less. The Stabrook News and a review of the 2012 consensus confirmed that the African Guyanese population comprised nearly 1/2 of the total population in Region 10 at 49%, 40.6% of Region 4, 33.1% of Region 5, and lesser proportions in relation to the other regions. The dropout rates, respectively, for those three regions are 44% for Linden, 44% for Region 5, and 46% in Region 3. That is published data. The current economic condition of African Guyanese is likely to be highly correlated to the deficit in education. So the less education we have is the less prospects for any sort of economic advancement. I said this in a program with David, and I didn't intend it to be alarmist, but I just want to say to you that in a modern, fancy Guyana, with Ferraris and other fancy cars here, gated communities, fantastic restaurants, snazzy lights, bright highways, and every time you turn on the TV, you're seeing signs of progress. If you are young, male, urban, you don't have to be urban, and African, and you don't make it past secondary school, what is your option? You only have one option because you are not going to sit down and watch the Ferraris and the Maseratis and the other cars drive up and down, walk through your neighborhood, pick up all the pretty girls, eat in fancy places, and everything will tell you that you are worthless. And the only sense that you will perceive and the only avenue that will be available to you to give you anything looking like respect is an AR-15 or an AK-47. And that is not a voluntary choice. That is an inevitable choice, because if you're going to participate, or if you want to participate in the wealth and you're not getting it legitimately, you are going to take it illegitimately. So we are condemning our young male Africans in particular who do not finish secondary school. And right now, the statistics say they're 50% to crime. We don't have to go further than Jamaica or Trinidad and Tobago to understand that once, and I see Mr. Conway here, once you head down the street of armed robberies and gated communities and kidnapping, you don't have a moment where you suddenly find Jesus and turn around. It never happens. We can speak to our Jamaican sisters and brothers. They have tried everything under every administration. GLP, PNP, and they have not been able to address crime to the extent that we saw that the Prime Minister of Jamaica, who was the Prime Minister for Tivoli Gardens, which was controlled by Dudas, was actually the prime minister was actually controlled by dudas. He could not send any law enforcement agency to arrest him unless Uncle Sam demanded it. And as a consequence, what happened? The Prime Minister of Jamaica had to resign because the warlord for Tivoli Gardens, had to be extradited. Now, Jamaica might have seemed like a distant prospect to us before oil and gas. It is coming to us like tomorrow is coming to us. And if we don't address this now, particularly on the educational front, we are going to be in perpetual crisis. Now, nobody escapes this crisis. This is not going to be only a crisis for the African community. Everybody will be affected by this. And so I want to recommend that fully funded policies and efforts for African Guyanese should be implemented as follows. Financial support to ensure the mandatory attendance at school. The implementation of relevant TVET and TVOT programs. Implementation of remedial education programs at the primary and secondary levels because we have to salvage those that have already fallen off the path. Implementation of large-scale adult remedial education programs because even if we might not have had the opportunity to be able to take advantage of the future, we have to be able to have the skills. And so those are my recommendations. But I am aware that my good friends at Coffee 250 said, today the subject is the state of African Guyanese in a one-sided one Guyana. But I think we missed the memo. It's not one Guyana. The government position is we own Guyana, and it don't include us. Their policy is not one Guyana, it's that they and their supporters own the country. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brother Nigel. Please give him another round of applause. What we're going to do now is we're going to have a panel of presenters, and I invite them to come on stage now. Mr. Vincent Alexander, Mr. Kimani Nehusi, Sister Don Holder, Mr. Paul Slow, is Mr. Slow here? No, he's not. Oh, he's coming. Okay. Huh? Oh, he's on Zoom. Hello, Mr. Paul.
Hello, Doc.
Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Each presenter will present. After each presentation, we'll take one or two questions. And I'll be looking at the time. If we're running out of time, we'll probably skip those questions. And then once the presenters are finished, we are going to open it up for a broader discussion. So please give the panelists a round of applause. And we'll start the ball rolling with Brother Kimani Nehusi, who will address the question of recognition. And this is one of the areas that has been identified by the United Nations in the international decade, the people of African descent. Brother Kimani Nehusi via Queenstown and Buxton, because he has citizenship of both villages. Brother Kimani.
Sisters and brothers, good afternoon. Good afternoon also to those who are looking and listening on Facebook, Zoom, and other spaces in cyberspace. I want to begin by thanking Coffee 250 for putting on this occasion. And not just merely putting it on this time, but for persisting in carrying this on every year. Our ability to continue to do things on behalf of our community, and especially to institutionalize our responses to our environment, is a measure of our success. And I hope that one of the things I'm going to point out is that the system that oppresses us has specialized in trying to disrupt and erase our institutional development. And you've had examples of that from the leader of the opposition and from Brother Nigel, who spoke to us before. I want also to thank my fellow panelists for helping to make this occasion one that I am quite confident will continue, and this is in the light of the two previous presentations, to be informative and therefore to help to address the needs of our community. I've been asked to speak on the question of recognition. And what I'm hoping to do is to ask ourselves and answer the question, recognition of whom or what? And I venture to say that the answers to those two questions look at the fundamentals of ourselves. Those things without which no group of people can ever get near to becoming what they need to be, much less what they could be. And it is very important that as we ask ourselves this question, who are we? What are we? Where do we come from? How did we get here? And therefore, what's in our interest? What must we do? We have to begin by placing ourselves in the full and complete historical and cultural context of ourselves. Part of our problem is that we have been miseducated on many fronts. And we're going to come back to repeating questions on education, I'm certain. But who are we involves a response that addresses our history and our culture. The word is identity. We need not bother ourselves and go deeply into what identity is. I think we all know. It's something that's so fundamental, the concept of ourselves, that without it, we wouldn't know what our real interests are. Without identity, we will be like rudderless ships upon a stormy sea. Any breeze will take us where it wants us. Today we might be Catholic, tomorrow we're Adventist, next day we're Rasta, 2 days after we cut off our locks, we are, all over the place because we're rudderless. We don't have a center. That comes from not knowing who we are. How did we get here to Guyana? Where do we come from? Where did our people's story begin? Even to know the answer of those questions in a most elementary way, without going into the large details, is a huge help for us. But the system that oppresses us, and I hope to demonstrate this, has specialized in disrupting our story, of cutting us off from our history. So we don't know who we are. And because we don't know who we are, we do not know what our genuine interests are. And because we do not know what our genuine interests are, we cannot defend them and we cannot advance them. We're up a stream without a paddle. And our resurrection starts with the recognition of our condition and taking back ourselves, our minds. Now, let me say something else. Identity is not nationality. Identity is not nationality. Too many African Guyanese have been confused on this question. We believe in a nonsensical proposition that in order to be one people, one nation with one destiny, we cannot be African Guyanese or we cannot be African. We have to be some kind of nebulous thing. And we've become very defensive on saying we're Africans. Well, to be African is to be your identity. It's not your nationality. Your nationality is Guyanese. And let's go a bit further and deeper. Anytime you mess with somebody's identity, you mess with them in a very fundamental way. And if you don't believe me, look at ourselves today. We're in a massive confusion. We're going backwards while other people are going forward. And big part of the problem, if they could fix one single thing about us, and you fixed our identity, the rest will correct itself. You could change your nationality. I could leave Guyana, as I did, go to another country, qualify for residence permit, get their passport. I'm a national of that country, United States, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, wherever. I could have 2 or 3 nationalities simultaneously. But the moment you begin to mess with my identity, this is fundamental. This is really serious. So anybody who is changing their identity or had their identities changed is in a real trouble, a real spot of bother. Because like I said before, your identity is what locates you in place and time. Your identity is what tells you what's right for you and what's wrong for you. Your identity tells you where you have been. Your identity tells you where you are. And your identity tells you where you need to go. There's an African wisdom saying that says, if you know the beginning well, the end will not trouble you. If you know the beginning well, the end will not trouble you. I'm a member of a department of Africology. Some say it's the leading department in the world in the study of African people. And we study African people from the points of view of African people. And two big principles we make is that you place African people in our entire history and in our culture, if you really want to understand us, our behaviors. So let us ask ourselves this question. Again, who are we? We're an African people. How do we relate to history? Well, our history did not begin when Western Europeans brought some of our ancestors in chains to this country. Our history began when history began. Humanity was born in black skin and fizzy hair under a tropical sky in Africa. The first human beings were Africans. And it is African people who created human culture, the values that we call human or humanistic today. It is African people who created the first civilizations in the world. An African state, Kemet, ancient Egypt, led the world for over 3,000 years. What are the consequences of this for us, of knowing this? Why do most of us don't know this? These are important things for us, but I want to rush on and say this. What happened? African people were doing great things, building the pyramids, building temples, damming rivers, changing the course of rivers through empoldering, draining marshes, all kinds of fantastic things, doing brain surgery and so on. And we're talking about thousands of years ago. So what happened? The answer is a single word, the Ma'afa. Ma'afa is a Kiswahili word that means great destruction. And the great destruction in Africa happens in two ways. First, Arab people invaded, using or abusing the religion of Islam. And then 6 centuries ago, Europeans did the same thing, using or abusing the religion of Christianity. And I want to address myself to the question of Christianity a bit later. 6 centuries ago, 600 years ago or so, Europe was a small, it still is, geographically small space in the western perimeter of Asia. It has no natural resources. It was a disease-ridden place. The people were fighting among themselves all the time. Read European history, Western European history, this war, that war, religious war, this, that, the other. But then they went around the world, armed to the teeth, and imposed themselves through violence, first military violence, upon other peoples. Check it. Wherever Western Europeans went, there was genocide. They created genocide. Go ask indigenous Americans. Ask Native Americans from North America about the Trail of Tears. Ask the Chinese about the Century of Humiliation. Ask the people of India about famines created by people like Winston Churchill that kill millions. Ask them about the destruction of their own industries and the looting of their country by Britain of trillions of pounds in today's calculation. So what about us, Africa? The Martha, the enslavement of African people. And we must know the consequences of that. We don't have time, but I would ask Coffee 250 to sponsor, or some other group to sponsor a symposium that goes deeply into what enslavement was and how it still affects our people today. Because we just know that we were enslaved and we don't know what it has meant and what it still means to us. We have to talk about the intergenerational traumas. We have to talk about how people try to make it into our shame when it's really their shame. They're the ones who behaved in this barbaric manner. We have to take possession of our history and know what happened to us. The consequences for us and for the continent of our ancestors still live among us. Europeans use physical violence and violence in every sphere, spiritual wickedness, economic warfare, they're still at it, to subjugate African people. But every time we revolted, and we did that all the time, their ultimate resort was to military violence, because they always held and make certain that they held the edge in that regard. Check our history and you're going to see political murder of transformative leaders, invasion of countries, all that is part of it. So enslavement, colonialism, neocolonialism, etc., are names given to different aspects of a system organized by Western Europeans to exploit other peoples. And our concern is with African people, and more precisely African Guyanese today. So those are different manifestations of the same system of historical oppression and exploitation imposed by Western Europeans in a series of empires. The Portuguese had theirs, the Spaniards, the British, the French, Germans for a little while, and the United States of America. The current hegemonic force, the US empire, is the one that rules some of the world today. And it's being challenged by tectonic shifts in the international neighborhood. And this is what plugs into contemporary history. But I just want to say that the United States is the most recent of a series of European empires, Western European empires. In this case, the location, the land base, is not in Western Europe, it's in North America, but it's still a Western European empire. So what's the sum total of all of this? What do we need to recognize from this? Well, here it is. We still inhabit colonial structures. We, African Guyanese people, still inhabit colonial structures because colonial structures still inhabit us. It doesn't matter which structure, which system you're talking about. The economic system that oppresses us was shaped by the colonial state. Our mental awareness, our minds, was shaped by the colonial experience. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Our social system, it doesn't matter which one you look at. It came out of that colonial moment and has been maintained. The structures have been maintained. It might be a change here and there, but for all intents and purposes, we are still dominated by systems set up centuries ago in our past. It's quite a long story to describe how that has been maintained. And Brother Nigel gave you some of the facts about the Portuguese and how they came to wealth, comparative wealth, and African people remain without wealth. It is African people who invented the retail trade in this country. Let me say this. African people invented the retail trade in this country. And Portuguese and other people were deliberately promoted to middle-class status while Africans were oppressed, prevented from attaining middle-class status en masse. A few of us managed to do that, but not in terms of wealth. And how did this occur? It wasn't only the license, the liquor license and so on. The tax system was used against us. The education system, so-called, was used against us. The religious system, Christianity, many of us have a thing about Christianity. We say, don't come between me and my God. And we refuse to examine Christianity. But one of the things I'm recommending is that African people have a new and a different relationship with ourselves and with all institutions, including the church. Think about it. How did the church, the Christian church, get into our lives? It was introduced during the time of enslavement. And it was introduced to enslave us in the most fundamental way, mentally, to tell us turn the other cheek, not to fight. Think about this. If somebody has kidnapped you and subjected you to the horrors of the barracoons, the Middle Passage, and plantation labor, could rape you, your mother, your brother, your sister, anybody, and this happened on the plantations regularly. What are the consequences of that? And how Christian is that? When John Hawkins went to Africa to begin the British leg of enslaving African people, he rode in a ship called the Good Ship Jesus. The Good Ship Jesus. That voyage was sponsored by the Church of England, the British state, the Queen, and he is a private individual. They had Christian prayers aboard every day. So Christianity has been used to entrap us. When, who was the leader of 1823? Come on, let me test you. Okay, good. I heard some murmurings there. I'm wrapping up. When Kwame elected not to kill white people, chief oppressors, he wasn't doing so out of some kind of humanitarian calculation that said this is the best military advantage. He was swayed by the gospel. And if you don't believe me, check South Africa, where Mandela and Tutu said, we must turn the other cheek. Let's have some truth and reconciliation. Around the same time, Jewish people caught an ex-Nazi. The man is 98. He's in a wheelchair. And you know what they told him? You did the crime, bro. So you got to do the time. But we're busy turning the other cheek. And the millions of acres of land stolen from African people by white people in South Africa have not been returned. Not a blade of grass has been returned. But we are good people. The West celebrates Mandela and Tutu, and they know why they're doing that. Let us be aware of this. So what happened to us is that in every single area, our interests have been injured. Systems imposed upon us that are not for us. We have been imprisoned in those systems spiritually, culturally, economically, and otherwise. We've been taught that we're nothing, that we have no history. We've been cut off from our history. We don't know ourselves. I just want to take 1 minute to give some solutions. Bob Marley, and even before him, Marcus Garvey told us about the people without knowledge of history and culture. It's rootless.
Recording in
And I want
progress.
us to begin from there and recognize that the restoration of our identity is central to our resurrection, our reconstitution of ourselves. Our restoration of culture is important. We need a new relationship with our past, with our culture, with ourselves, with institutions like Christianity and education. We need to restore cooperatives. That's a whole discourse in itself. And let me say this, that the state, the colonial state, has been responsible for managing the imposition of these limiting things upon ourselves, these limiting systems upon African Guyanese. And therefore, it is important for us to calculate to be independent of the state I'm not saying we mustn't budget the state, make representation to get our just returns, but it's important for us not to become wards of the state or dependent in any way. We need to advocate for the address of the historical injustices suffered and still suffered by our people. We need to train our people in citizenship, the rights of citizens. And above all, let's follow our ancestors. The ancient Egyptians have a phrase, Wehemi Mesu, and it means the repeating of the births. Africans in Ghana talk about, and other wells, talk about Sankofa. Let us revisit our past to identify things that are important for finding solutions in the present. We have work to do, and I ask us, I implore us, I dare us to begin to do this more and more together. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Nehusi. And we're going to skip the questions for obvious reasons. The next presenter is going to be Vincent Alexander. Then we move to Mr. Paul Slow, then Sister Holder Kush, yes. And right. So Vincent, Mr. Paul Slow, then Sister Kush, and then we're going to open it up for general questions because we're running a little bit behind time. Thank you. Let's welcome Vincent.
Thank you very much, Bwana Mwenyekiti, Hamjambo, Menzangu. I have been asked to speak about the state of things in this decade from the perspective of Ipadaji. But before I do that, I want to do two things as a rejoinder to what Nigel said earlier. Nigel recognized certain persons for the work they're doing. And like a good African, in a state of humility, he omitted himself. So I would like to join him. He has, in fact, been doing a fantastic job in the course of this struggle that we're ensuing. He made the point about the importance, and it's been made repeatedly, the importance of education and the significance of free education in 1974. And I always like to take the opportunity when the question of free education is mentioned to share with people my own experience. When I did common entrance, I qualified to go to one of the paid schools. And in fact, in those days, all of the schools were paid, though some people got scholarships to 5, QC to St. Joseph. But all of the schools were paid schools. And I qualified for tutorial high school. I couldn't go because my mother, I didn't say my parents, right? My mother couldn't afford to send me. And so I stayed back in primary school for one additional year, wishing and hoping the chance would come for me to be able to go to high school. That chance only came because the next year I sat every entrance exam across the country, every entrance exam. I passed all of them.
and Chatham, a school that no longer exists, gave me a partial scholarship. The fees was $40 a term. My scholarship was $15 a term for the first 3 years. And my big sister, who was just starting to teach, says, the fact that I demonstrated a desire to go to high school, that she will pay my fees from her salary. And that's how I went to high school. So I have a tremendous appreciation and understanding of what free education means, and find it unacceptable when I've had cause to read in our papers in the past, some of the elites criticizing free education because they could have afforded education, and they don't know that free education can be compared to quality, good or bad education. Can only be compared to not having an education. And I think we need to understand that. Copy 250 is with us once again, 2023. Looking at the state of the African Guyanese. But they're doing so once again in a year of the decade for the people of African descent, a decade declared by the United Nations. And therefore, whilst we look at the state of African Guyanese, my task is to look at this decade and what movement has there been, if there has been any, in relation to the people of African descent. And in many regards, you can take all of the contributions made so far and to be made in that context. What has happened during this decade? But before I proceed to that, I want to take you back a wee bit as to why we have this decade. And I first of all want to reference the Durban Conference and to remind you that in the Durban Conference, there was a declaration, one of the provisions of which says, recognizing that failure to combat and denounce racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance by all, especially by public authorities and politicians at all levels, is a factor encouraging their perpetuation, the perpetuation of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerances. That was one of the clauses in the Durban Declaration, a declaration that led to the decade. Another clause says, reaffirming that states have the duty to protect and promote the human rights and fundamental freedoms of all victims, and that they should apply a gender perspective, recognizing the multiple forms of discrimination which women can face, and that the enjoyment of their civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights is essential for the development of societies throughout the world. And replacing gender there, in this instance, to cater for all beings. Here is what that Durban Declaration said. And so we ask ourselves, what has occurred? Has there been change? What have our politicians and public authorities been doing in relation to this call by the Durban Declaration? We can attribute to the United Nations the declaration of the decade with specific objectives. One, to strengthen national, regional, and international action. National, regional, and international action, and cooperation in relation to the full enjoyment of economic, social, cultural, civic, and political rights by people of African descent, and their full and equal participation in all aspects of the society. Two fundamental things there: enjoying the rights and full participation. Two, to promote a greater knowledge of and respect for the diverse heritage, culture, and contribution of the people of African descent to the development of societies. And three, to adopt and strengthen national, regional, and international legal frameworks in accordance with the Durban Declaration and the Program of Action and International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and to ensure their full and effective implementation. This is what was intended, starting with the Durban Declaration, coming on to the United Nations Declaration of a Decade for the people of African descent. It is these objectives that inspired the formation of IPADG in pursuit of the objectives. At that time, with the encouragement, if not the initiative of the state. That's how IPADG came about, in pursuit of these. It therefore meant that IPADG had a mandate to be pursued in two ways. To be pursued in terms of how the people themselves could come to the plate, how the people of African descent themselves could be organized to come to the plate, to the table, but also to be pursued in a manner that required the state to take certain actions in response to those objectives. In the instance of Guyana, the then government in 2013 signed on to the Declaration of the United Nations. They signed on. But have they, in fact, fulfilled any of the obligations to which they signed on? And my answer would be simply no. Would be simply no. Notwithstanding what these declarations said about the state of the people of African descent, we have a situation where our government says we appreciate and recognize the people of African descent because they struggle for emancipation. Full recognition. But beyond that, they're now in a state where all of us are equal, and the government is doing everything for everybody, and there's no need for special attention to the people of African descent. That is not what this declaration spoke about. The declaration sought to say that there was need for special attention. And in fact, the word they use, that has been used today, is for equitable attention. Equitable attention. IPADG has sought to pursue these objectives. We have sought, for example, to fund night schools. You heard about education, you heard about catching up. We have sought to fund night schools. In stopping this subvention, one of the things the government did is to stop or attempt to stop the funding of night schools. People are caught up out there about whether Alexander get money and take money. Even if I take money, the impact of what they've done is not to deprive me of taking money alone. It's to deprive our children the opportunity of attending night schools. The Prodigy has sought through donations to continue the work of those two night schools, one in Kilidonan and one here in Sophia. And we have to be grateful to those teachers who have said to us they understand the plight of the Prodigy and the children, and they don't hassle us for payment, though we try to pay them whenever the money is available. The Prodigy has made a submission for the training of seafarers, a program to train seafarers. That's the lower level of the oil and gas and the maritime industry. We have the curriculum. We have the person who will deliver. All we want the government to do is to give that program the recognition, because the way oil and gas and the maritime industry is organized, if you aren't trained in a recognized place, you ain't going nowhere no matter how much training you get. We have sought to use GITC as the conduit for that purpose. That proposal is languishing. It had nothing to do with the subvention, but it is today languishing in the education system for want of action, where we want to train young people. Like we did when we first came on board. It's almost an untold story that we got funds from basic needs, and trained 50 auto electricians at GITC at no cost to them. 50 of them were trained in our very first, I think it was our first year, 2018, 2019. Prodigy has approached the last and present government on the question of the teaching of history and the manner in which it's taught in our schools. We approached them at a time when they were doing curriculum reform. We could never get a meeting with the minister on this matter. But we work at the lower level, made approaches, made propositions, and were told when we're doing reform, we'll work with it. When I inquired recently what has become of the reform in history, I was told they only reform the core subjects. And in Guyana, history is not a core subject. So that too is languishing. We also approached the government on the question of the reinstituting of village councils. Not to dismantle the regions, not to dismantle the neighborhoods, but to have village councils reinstituted. Because for all intents and purposes, the present local government system has imposed aliens and put them in charge of lands that were purchased. I use a fancy words like ancestral lands. lands which were purchased by our ancestors, have fallen into the hands and the control of people who don't look like us. And the idea was that at minimum, if you had village councils and you returned the responsibility for lands to those councils, at minimum, it would fall under the control of those who look like us. And hopefully, they'll be thinking like us. But that's another problem. And we talked about mental slavery earlier. That is still something that has not been addressed. Although our Constitution, and if I'm not mistaken, is Article 72, provides for the institution of village councils at the behest of the villagers. And a resolution was passed in this room calling on the government to reinstitute village councils. That is still to happen. Ipadaji started its work probably wrong-footed. In 2017, when we were working and developing Ipadaji, it was brought to our attention that there were funds available at basic needs and the funds available at the Small Business Bureau. And we collected a number of projects coming down to the end of 2017 and went off to those places with those projects to try to get them funded. A few were funded. The most successful was the auto electrician. The one with the greatest potential was the fishing project in Victoria, which we ourselves turned off because of internal village problems. But that project was intended to relocate a fish operation in Victoria and to do training of the youths in Victoria to get involved in fishing. And the facility would have taken off the fish. There was no question of a market for the fish. And the monies were allocated by basic needs for that project, but our own quibbling caused it not to happen. But I mentioned that to say that that approach at the very inception created a fervor in our community for funding of projects. And when Ipadaji failed to deliver on the funding of projects, then there were some problems. But the fact of the matter is, conceptually, and if you listen to the objectives I mentioned, our main task was not the funding of projects, because the funding of projects don't necessarily address the issues, the institutional issues, and the legal issues, which are historical and continuing, that have caused the people of African descent to be in the state that they're in. That doesn't mean we should have projects, but I'm saying that will not be the fundamental redress to our problem. And so sometime last year, we caught ourselves in some regards and sat down and started to work out what we refer to as the priorities in terms of what we think the state should be doing. And having worked those out, then is when we wrote the president and said, let's have a talk. Because by then we were prepared to put all of the issues on the table. And in our own minds, we were saying what should happen. We speak with the president first, and then we have sectoral talks, education, agriculture, etc. Those talks got nothing to do with who thief money or if people stole money. It has to do with advancing the objectives of the decade. To date, having written the president thrice, and the president having promised twice, there have been no talks. But what I have heard him say when he addressed some people of African descent, at least by pigmentation, at State House, is that he will be speaking to the people directly, to the communities directly. In other words, he ain't talking to Padaji. And he said that in Mocha Arcadia as well. I'm not talking to your elected representatives. And Jagdio said it in Plaisance. I ain't talking to the council. And so what we see is a government that is refusing, in the circumstance of even a constitution that says they must talk. You have heard about Article 14. And if you go to Article 13, that article tells you the obligation the state has to speak with the people about matters that affect them. And we're living in a state that openly and blatantly refuses to have the conversation in the decade on matters about the decade. And so that is really the problem we have got to confront at this time. How do we bring the state to the table? How we ensure that the state takes its obligations, legal obligations, moral obligations, inherited obligations, because it's the successor state of those states that brought us to where we're at. How do we get them to the table to do what they should be doing? How do we get them to understand that the narrative of equality does not reflect the reality of Guyana? That the reality of Guyana is that the people of African descent, as has been told to you today already, have been affected by historical systems and policies that has disadvantages us, not only materially, but in the worst case, psychologically. And that there is need for the redress because we have inherited all of the consequences of those policies, in as much as the policies are still continuing. Nigel mentioned the continuation in terms of how contracts are distributed. It has nothing to do with equity. Who got money got luck. Or who got money get bargain. That's what the Northman they say. Who got money get bargain. Black people got money, they can't get no bargain. So who get money get bargain. So colleagues, my little presentation is all about the fact that we've embarked upon a decade. From our side, the side of the people of African descent, we have sought to put mechanisms in place to address the issues that ought to be addressed. But that these issues cannot be addressed outside of the state. And I'm particularly saying the state as opposed to the government. But of course, the government is a part of the state. It's the machinery of the state. Cannot be addressed outside. And we are faced with a government that, first of all, refuses to recognize the real state of people of African descent, refuses to have the conversation to address the matter. The United Nations say there should be a program. Our government has no program and never reported to the United Nations. Padaji has gone to the United Nations on occasions. And Jagdio said we were sneaking off to go to the UN. That's how we described our attendance at the UN, as sneaking off. But having sneaked off 2 times, when the 3rd meeting came in the UN in New York, they sent the Minister of Tourism. They didn't send the responsible minister. The same minister who turned up the other day with the new something, that is the African minister, the minister of tourism. They sent the man from the ERC, who should be solving the problem in Guyana, went to make an excuse for the government. And they sent one of our own to the UN to tell the UN not to say what the program is, not to report as they should report, but to say don't listen to these other people who sneaking off to come and speak with you. So that's the situation we're faced with, an attempt to erase from the face of the Guyanese landscape the body of people who are trying to represent the interests of the people of African descent. And by that consequence, to also negatively impact, if not erase, the issues of the people of African descent from the agenda of Guyana. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brother Vincent. We'll have a slight adjustment. We'll have Sister Kush go next, and then Mr. Paul Slow will wrap up this segment of our program. Please let us welcome Don Holder Kush, an attorney at law and public advocate. Sister Don.
Thank you. I believe it's King David, correct?
Not quite King.
But it's King Eric, it's Chief and Chief Eric? Okay.
Chief Eric, yeah.
Chief Eric is here?
No.
He was here earlier. And I want to acknowledge the former Prime Minister and former Mayor of the city of Georgetown, Mr. Hamilton Green. Welcome all. Everybody been talking and talking. You hear it? Everybody crying out for peace. Nobody's crying out for justice. These two basic human rights are elusive to most people of African descent in Guyana. When the current Vice President Barry Jagdeo was president, he attended an India Day parade and he's quoted as saying, "India is alive and well in Guyana." Eli? I recall giving that information tonight, that he was because that was during the King Kong trial. It is indeed an honor to be invited by Coffee 250 to be a member of this illustrious panel. And more importantly, the only woman. I will not let the women down, as my voice is theirs. The topic of this whole session is one-sided justice in one Guyana. It's very timely. Justice in the broadest sense is the concept that individuals are to be treated in a manner that is equitable and fair. That does not exist in Guyana, unfortunately. So we have one-sided justice, which is some individuals being treated in a manner that is equitable and fair, and those persons who don't get that because they tend to look like us. One Guyana, the president, His Excellency Dr. Irfan Ali said, is a social contract of inclusion. One Guyana's vision is about creating a more equal society, guaranteeing that everyone is afforded the opportunity to lead productive and happy lives, as well as reducing inequality in access to education, health, employment, income, and justice. Well, I don't know what President Ali is talking about. It certainly doesn't relate to the Guyana I live in. If you're speaking of justice, the place where one goes to seek justice is the court. The Honorable Attorney General, before he was Attorney General, he bragged about his government bringing the constitutional reform after the Herd-Manson Accord, which was signed by Her Excellency President Janet Jagan, and opposition leader Mr. Hugh Desmond Hoyt, OE Senior Counsel, in St. Lucia in July 1998. As a result of this accord, there was constitutional reform. And Mr. Nandalal, as he then was, claimed glory that came from the change in the Constitution, making it the first in the English-speaking Caribbean to provide for agreement by the President and the honorable opposition leader to agree to the appointment of the Chancellor and Chief Justice. In April 7, 2022, Guyana Times reported that the Honorable Attorney General, Minister of Legal Affairs, Mr. Anil Nandalal, SC, MP, stated that in the current formula that requires consensus between the president and opposition leader has not worked in the more than 2 decades it was put in place. So we have an acting chancellor, Madam Justice Yonit Cummins, ORCCH, and an acting chief justice, Madam Justice Roxanne George, CCH, SC, in those positions for 6 years. The president has not come out and said when this will happen or what will happen. It is disrespectful to our top judicial officers to be acting for so many years. So Dennis Byron, QC, PC, former president of the Caribbean Court of Justice, and the current president of the Caribbean Court of Justice, Mr. Justice Adrian Saunders, commented negatively on this situation. One would have thought that that would be enough embarrassment to push this government to confirm these 2 young ladies of the highest integrity, brilliant, humble, and well respected by members of the bar, and 2 presidents of the CCJ. The opposition leader made it clear that he supported their consummation. You know what came after that? Minister Gail Teixeira said, no, that's not how it goes. The president will tell you, and then you will respond. But we're not dealing with that, right? Right on the Constitution is one thing. But these ladies react for 6 years. And I ask all the ladies here, hope when you see me processing, you all come and join me, please. They are now members of the Judicial Service Commission. These ladies are now members of the Judicial Service Commission. And part of their jobs is to appoint judges and magistrates who will be confirmed while they remain acting. I believe that the retirement age, retirement age for the Chancellor is 72. The Chancellor is 72. Retirement age for the Chancellor. 72, I think. Yeah, I think the Chancellor retires at 72. So I don't know if they're going to have Justice Cummins acting until she's 72 years old. In the judicial system, those who may have committed minor offenses are either remanded or placed on reasonable bail but can't afford it. Then those with deep pockets can afford the best lawyers, one who's here today. But he also does a lot of good work for the people. We have junior lawyers working with them, doing research, and at times doing the preliminary inquiry. But probably the most glaring example, in my mind, that happened to somebody of African descent is what happened to Brigadier Godfrey Best in the Guyana Defense Force. Godfrey Best acted as the Chief of Staff of the Guyana Defense Force until the day before he retired, and he was confirmed as Chief of Staff. At that same function at the President's office, Colonel Omar Khan was promoted to Brigadier, and the President presented him with his instruments to perform the functions of the Chief of Staff. I mean, that is just so, this man has acted all the time. You're going to confirm him one day before, but that's what they did. Now you have Mr. Charandas Prasad, who was responsible for the APNU coalition losing the no confidence motion. He returned to Canada, and later he was appointed High Commissioner to India, where he allegedly was verbally abusive to an elderly woman who attempted to look after stray animals. It took this government months to bring this man home. And the Sabbath News recently reported that Mr. Chandas Prasad is still on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs payroll. This reminds me of the King Kong case that Mr. Nigel Hughes at the time was representing one, Mr. Freddie Kissoon, who was sued by Ibarra Jagdeo for commenting Freddie said he was King Kong. And the late Dr. Roger Luncheon said on the oath, on the cross-examination, that there were no qualified blacks to be appointed ambassadors and high commissioners. There's one right here today, Ambassador Raw Lucas. Right? You also have Ambassador Miles, Ambassador Ronald Austin, Cedric Joseph, and many others. But Dr. Luncheon, I don't know if he believed it or he was told he had to say it. I really don't know. The justice system must be fair. If a settlement is to be offered to the deceased families, sorry, I think I missed something here. Anyway, I'm talking about the Mahdia situation. The government offered them a settlement of $5 million, the families. If a settlement is to be offered to, it should follow the way the courts would work out the figure for loss of life as a result of the government's negligence. The Guyana Fire Service said on 2 occasions they visited the dorm and the school and found them to be heavily grilled and padlocked. The last visit was in February 2023. And this was communicated to the school officials. I don't know if this was communicated to the Minister of Education. The Honorable Attorney General's settlement of $5 million for each child that died to their parents is ludicrous. In calculating damages for loss of life are factors to be considered: age, potential earnings, and emotional distress, among others. One child was 5 years old, the others between 15 and 16. Yet the formula to calculate damage was not applied. That is not justice for the families whose children perished in a fire. When they had the COI into Linden, the commissioners sent back what they recommended to be paid. And the figures were different. Figures were different for everybody. One got 3, one got 2, and one got $1 million. And from Mahdia, I go to Monrepo. The vendors at the Monrepo market suffered loss after protest action arising out of an incident at Golden Grove. The persons charged with terrorism are represented by Dexter Todd and me, so I won't want to say much. One vendor claimed she lost $3 million in palauri, egg balls, puri, and fish cake. The government provided a $100,000 grant the next day after the incident without any verification. But the vendors were not happy, and some claimed their losses were in excess of $500,000. The Minister of Human Services and Social Security, Dr. Vinay Prasad, along with other government officials, distributed boxes containing 70 pounds of frozen bangameri. The compensation was paid the following days. I said, who got luck, eat pork. We see multi-storied buildings going up all the time, and fancy cars, the Lamborghinis and so on, while our people struggle to make ends meet. One Guyana is not inclusive, it is exclusive, right? It is meant to benefit the people who support the People's Progressive Party / Civic, if the Civic still exists. How long are we going to sit around and beg the government to do what the Constitution said they must do? Treat us with equal rights. Our ancestors did not come on no Hesperus or the Whitby. Many were their documents, tradition, and culture intact. More than 4 million of our ancestors came on slave ships in the most inhumane conditions. We were branded as property of the slave master, given English names, including David, and converted to Christianity. Our cry has always been for justice and one-sided justice in our country, where the motto is one people, one nation, one destiny. There's urgent need for a public conversation. This administration has to be respectfully involved to have a conversation with the Black agenda. We need equal rights and justice, and I believe that is the most important thing at this stage. And I thank you all for listening to me. One love to my brothers and sisters. Let's all work together.
Thank you very much, Sister Dawn. We are now going to have Mr. Paul Slow. The technicians, are you all set? No? All right, over to the technicians.
Good afternoon, one and all. Can you hear me? Technicians, I need confirmation that you can hear me before I proceed. I guess I am seeing a comment here that yes, I can be heard. Just want confirmation. I don't want to proceed unless the technicians advise me that I'm good to go. People are saying yes, so I think I'll commence.
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
Good afternoon to all the persons present, those live and those who are on the virtual platform. I want to commence by taking this opportunity to congratulate Coffee 250 and thank them for offering me this opportunity to make this brief presentation on security. During the presentation, I look at the subject that I was asked to speak on, that is public security, and I will do so with reference to today's theme, which is the state of the African Guyanese in a one-sided one Guyana. I look at a few areas. I will briefly touch on what is public security. Then I'll tell you who is responsible for public security. Then I will look at the role of the Guyana Police Force in relation to public security, the structure of the force to carry out its mandate. I will look at the marginalization of Afro-Guyanese policemen and women, the weaponization of the Guyana Police Force against Afro-Guyanese. I look at the crime figures because that will give you some context when we speak about public safety. Now, and then I'll close by making a few recommendations. Now, public security or public safety, as some people refer to it, is the same thing, is the prevention of and protection from events that could endanger the safety and security of the public from significant danger, injury, or property damage. Public security refers to provision of law enforcement, emergency medical service, fire prevention and suppression, and emergency management by local government entities. Public safety is the responsibility of the government. It has to ensure the protection of citizens, persons in the territory, organizations, and institutions against threat to their well-being, survival, and prosperity. In Guyana, the primary agency for the provision of public security is the Guyana Police Force. Other agencies include the Guyana Fire Service, the Guyana Prison Service, and the Guyana Defense Force. I must add that the role of the Guyana Defense Force in public safety is to support the civil authority, i.e. the police. Now let me look on the Guyana Police Force, because as we said, it is the primary agency for public safety and security. As stated above, the Guyana Police Force is a primary law enforcement organization in Guyana and therefore plays a critical role in the provision of public safety and security. The role of the Guyana Police Force is outlined in Section 3.2 of the Police Act of the Laws of Guyana, Chapter 16:01. And it says it's the prevention and detection of crime, the preservation of law and order, the repression of internal disturbance, the protection of property, the apprehension of offenders, and the due enforcement of all laws and regulations with which it is directly charged. I will posit here that for the force to deliver its mandate, the members must be carefully selected, well-trained and equipped, competently led, strategically deployed, free from political control and interference, and properly and adequately remunerated. The empirical evidence before us suggests that the force currently lacks those critical ingredients and consequently is currently incapable of providing the level of public safety and security that is critical if Guyana is to develop. Now, the police force is divided into 12 regional police divisions, which are generally aligned with the 10 administrative regions of the country. These are in addition to several branches at force headquarters. Due to historical factors, the Guyana Police Force has a numerical dominance of African men and women. It is suggested that many factors, including government policies, religious beliefs, demographics, among others, have led to this situation. Over the years, there have been several commissions, including the Disciplined Forces Commission of 2004, that have looked at this numerical imbalance and made recommendations to address the same. However, despite all efforts, the imbalance remains.
Oh, there you are.
Since assuming office in 2020, the
Very nice.
current government
Old time say.
has made a concerted effort to place Indian Guyanese police officers in management positions at the expense of their more I think I was muted there a bit by mistake. I was saying that since assuming office in 2020, the current government has made a concerted effort to place Indian Guyanese police officers in senior management position at the expense of their more experienced African Guyanese counterpart. Currently, regional police divisions 1, 2, 3, 4B, 4C, 6, and 8 are commanded by Indo-Guyanese police officers. In many of those cases, the second in command and other key positions are also held by inexperienced and unqualified Indian Guyanese police officers. In addition, several other important departments within the force, such as operations, SOCU, finance, are held by Indian Guyanese police officers, most of whom, I submit, are unqualified and lack the necessary experience to occupy those important senior positions. Many hold the view, with justification I might add, that the only reason these officers are placed in those important positions is because of their ethnicity and the perception that they support the current government. The converse is also true. That is, the only reason that many qualified and experienced African policemen and women are denied senior positions is because of their ethnicity and the perception that they support the opposition political parties. It is significant to note that most of the regional police divisions commanded by Indian Guyanese police officers are in the major population centers of Guyana. On the other hand, the regional police division commanded by Afro-Guyanese policemen, apart from Regional Police Division 4A, 5, and 10, are in the remote areas of Guyana with sparse population. It was also noted, and this is very significant, it was also noted that during the last promotion of senior officers in July 2022, Indian police officers were favored ahead of their African counterparts. Now, let me give you some figures here to support this contention. Of the 8 persons promoted to the rank of Assistant Commissioner of Police, only 3 were Africans. In the case of the 11 ranks promoted to Senior Superintendent, only 4 were Africans.
Wow.
In the case of Senior Superintendent, only 8 of the 21 ranks who were promoted were African policemen. Similar disproportionalities were observed in the lower rank structure. This disproportionality is difficult to justify given the numerical dominance of African policemen and women in the force, many of whom are highly qualified and experienced. There can be no doubt that given the important legal mandate of the Guyana Police Force, it has a critical role to play in the maintenance of public safety and security. And this requires well-motivated members. There is compelling evidence that in recent years, the Guyana Police Force has been weaponized by the current administration to go after African Guyanese, especially those in the opposition political parties and persons perceived to be supporters of the of those parties. And we have some examples. Don alluded to, we have the former Minister of Finance, Winston Jordan, arrested and charged with misconduct. Someone earlier mentioned the case of Takumu Ogunsi, was arrested, charged for attempting to incite racial hostility. What was very concerning about that entire incident is that the police issued a wanted bulletin, as is their want now, without making any effort to contact Ogunsi. And over the past years, we have seen that has become a practice. And Ogunsi, having turned himself in the company of his lawyer, was denied bail and kept in custody for 72 hours. He was then shackled, handcuffed, and taken to court to answer the charge. More recently, we had the case of former Minister of Public Infrastructure, David Patterson, who is charged under the Sexual Offences Act for exposing his genitals. The circumstances clearly suggest that it's a case of indecent exposure under the Summary Jurisdiction Act. And then we had this egregious act, the arrest of Attorney-at-Law Tamika Clark, a female African, on October 28, 2022, by ranks of the Special Organized Crime Unit for advising our client to remain silent during questioning by the police. That one gained a lot of publicity. We know that civil action was brought. The Chief Justice found that the police acted unconstitutionally, and I think damages are to be awarded. And on the other hand, persons who are associated with the current government are given a free pass. We have the well-publicized case of former Minister of Local Government, Nigel Damlal, who was accused of grooming, raping, and sodomizing a 16-year-old indigenous schoolgirl. The investigation that followed that can only be described as a travesty of justice. Suffice to say that the Director of Public Prosecutions clearly went against the relevant laws when she recommended to the police that Damlal should not face any criminal charges. Another example, we had the Regional Executive Officer of Region 9, Carl Singh, accused of shooting a 25-year-old woman in her abdomen in Letem. And this is another case of an indigenous woman being victimized. That is in July 2021. It was reported that he was sent on leave pending investigation. He was made to resume duties and was never charged. There are numerous other cases which clearly shows that the system discriminates against African Guyanese. The current situation in the Guyana Police Force cries out for disaggregated information Attorney Nigel Hughes spoke about disaggregated information so that one can get a better understanding of the gravity of the discrimination against African policemen and women within the force. And I say here too that there is also empirical evidence that African Guyanese, especially males, are victims of unlawful profiling by the police. The same is true with respect to African villages and communities. I want to close by saying that despite the figures given by the Guyana Police Force claiming that crimes are down, the president parroted the same statement not so long ago, public security in Guyana is in a perilous situation. The World of Statistics in its 2022 report stated that Guyana has the 7th highest crime rate in the world, and that is per capita. Only Trinidad and Tobago in the English-speaking Caribbean at number 6 has a higher crime rate. Only recently, in July last month, the United States Embassy in Guyana issued an advisory to its citizens, which stated, and I quote here, reconsider travel to Guyana due to crime. Violent crime, including murder and robbery, is common, especially at night. They go on to say, local police often lack the resources to respond effectively to serious criminal incidents. From this, we can safely say that public safety and security in Guyana, as I alluded to before, is in a perilous position. In terms of recommendations, I would think, as I said, there is need for disaggregated information about the Guyana Police Force. And what we're talking about here, what are the numbers? What's the strength? How many males, how many females? How many African Guyanese, how many Indian Guyanese? And then we can go by rank structure. And that will give a clearer picture as to what the real situation is. And as Nigel said, once you get that, then you can think about interventions. You can think about equity and all of that. Without that, you are not likely to address the main issues. And then I say here too, drastic reform of the Guyana Police Force, especially senior personnel practices, must be done. If we want to bring public safety and security to some acceptable level, we have got to talk about the reorganization of the force. I say here too that the force must be made to act independently and professionally. This was alluded to by some of the earlier presenters. There is no doubt when we see how the force currently acts, they do not act in a professional way. And if you do not act in a professional way, you're not going to get the much needed cooperation from members of the public so that you can be on top of public safety and security. And then the last recommendation I have here is that the force must be free from political interference. The force must be free from political interference. I mentioned the case earlier with the attorney Tamika Clark, who was arrested by the police for advising her client not to give a statement to the police. And in that matter, the Attorney General is on record as saying that he called the person in charge of the unit and either instruct or advise them to send the attorney away. That is political interference. The Attorney General has no right to call a unit in the Guyana Police Force to give instructions. And that is only one example. So I close by saying that, again, that these issues have to be addressed in a very comprehensive manner. If we do not do that, we're not going to be, or the police are not going to be in a position to provide the necessary public safety and security that is so needed if we are going to, if the country in this oil and gas industry is to develop. I thank you much for your attention, and I will be part of the panel to field any questions that the audience or anyone in the virtual sphere may have. Thank you very much.